welcome to part 2 of this 2-part Barstow Travel Adventure video program about family camping in 48 states. I'm Robbins Barstow, and in this millennial year of 2000, it's my pleasure to share with you some more of the exciting experiences which our family had way back 40 years ago in 1960 and 61, touring across our whole country and camping. When our 3 children, Mary, David, and Daniel, were growing up here in Wethersfield, we embarked on a momentous, really, plan to go and try to see if we couldn't actually visit in every one of the 48 contiguous states. We used a Rambler station wagon with a little one-wheel trailer behind it, and we slept in tents and sleeping bags almost every night in a different place because we had so much ground to cover here. We stayed in national parks. We visited a total of 18 national parks during the 5 summers of our plan, and we stayed with in station wagon little state parks, and occasionally by the roadside, any place where we had to in the middle of the night. We occasionally stayed with friends and with relatives when we saw them along the way, but we not once in the whole 5 summers of these trips stayed in a motel or a hotel. That was a matter of pride for us. We were trying to do this on the minimum expense, and we actually did make it that way. In part 1, we showed you where we went on the first 3 of these 5 summers of touring the country. We did New England states, 6 states in 1957, and then in 1958 we added 4 states from the north central area of the country and the 5 Great Lakes. Then in 1959 we did the whole southeast over here and added 14 more states. So that meant now we had a total of 24 states after the first 3 summers, and we had 24 more to go during 1960 and 1961. Before starting out in those last 2 summer trips, however, I do have to tell you that there was one Pacific state that our family had already visited back in 1956, and that was the state of California. This was as a result of our family having won a nationwide contest sponsored by Scotch brand cellophane tape. Our younger son Daniel had submitted an entry which was one of 25 winners, and it meant that our whole family got a free trip all the way out across the country. They flew us by, not jet plane, they didn't have jets then, but by propeller plane all the way across the country, 10 hours to California, and we had a whole week out there at Disneyland and other attractions. And actually that meant that California was already checked off on our list of 48 states, but it made us all the more anxious to go back there again another time. Now, 1960 was a big summer. We were going all the way across the country. We traveled a total of 9,705 miles. We did it in 31 days. That meant an average of 313 miles a day. And some days we drove even over 500 miles. So you can see we were on the road a lot, but we had a lot of territory to cover. And we wanted to visit all these national parks we've been reading about in the National Geographic and other books. And we did. We visited 7 of them, and we picked up 16 additional states. All right, now here's the route that we followed in 1960. Starting again in Connecticut, we went through Pennsylvania and the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and then across Ohio, and through Indiana, and through Illinois, and up to Iowa, across Iowa, and to Nebraska, and then up through Nebraska to South Dakota, and over to the Badlands and the Black Hills of South Dakota. And then we drove 150 miles all the way up to North Dakota, just so we could say we'd been in North Dakota, and back down to the Devil's Tower in Wyoming, and over to the other side of Wyoming where Yellowstone National Park is, and the Grand Teton National Park below Yellowstone. Then up into Montana, and all the way to the top of Montana in Glacier National Park. And from Glacier Park we went over through the little state of Idaho, the top of Idaho, into Washington, and in Washington all the way over to Seattle, and over to the Olympic Peninsula, the Olympic National Park, and then down the west coast here, we'd reach the Pacific Ocean, and down through Oregon over to Crater Lake. And then we had to come back over here and go through Idaho again, and down to Utah and Salt Lake City, and then over to Colorado. And in Colorado we went to Denver, down to the Royal Gorge, and then over here, and by this time we were getting really tired and had to zip home through Kansas and up through Missouri and back again all the way as fast as we could home. As you can imagine, we were really exhausted when we got back from that trip, but it was just a fabulous time. And now here we are, the Barstow camping summer of 1960 to the great Northwest and the wilderness parks up there. Our favorite gas station in Wethersfield has always been the Mobile service station at the corner of Wells Road and Silas Deane Highway. The last thing we did when we took off on our summer trips was to fill up the car with gas here at what was then known as Jimmy's service station. Its owner at that time was a wonderfully friendly man named James Waits, and every year he would come out to wish us well on our trip. The station is now known as Cross Automotive, and its present owner is Jimmy's son-in-law, Cesar Rosito. Jimmy was always interested in where we were going, and David and Daniel were excited to show him on a big map the cross-country route we had laid out for ourselves to follow in 1960. With this as a kind of an official send-off, we headed west, aiming this time to drive all the way to the Pacific Ocean, more than 3,000 miles away. Our first major stopover in 1960 was in the state of Ohio, at a farm where Meg's sister Betty and her family lived. The cousins enjoyed seeing each other, and you could tell which ones were Barstows by the bright red matching shirts which Meg had made for us. This also gave us a chance to show off our new camp kitchen, a compact portable wooden chest which Rob had actually made himself to store food and cooking and eating utensils, with a special shelf or cubbyhole for each needed item. It proved to be a very handy and useful addition to our camping equipment. The boys enjoyed a tractor ride around the farm and encounters with various farm animals. Our next state, Indiana, is the home of Earlham College, a Quaker institution which Mary was interested in attending after high school. Visiting a college like this en route was a side benefit of our summer travels, and Mary did, in fact, later enroll in Earlham College, from which she graduated in 1966. Continuing on through the state of Illinois, we had the opportunity to learn much more about the life of Abraham Lincoln. This statue of Lincoln as a young man stands at the entrance to New Salem Village, an authentically reconstructed pioneer settlement as it was at the time Lincoln lived here in the 1830s. The children were interested in this historic Conestoga wagon, which carried families and their limited possessions to new frontiers in the West, pulled by teams of oxen. The store and post office where Lincoln worked has been restored, and we were able to send cards to friends back home, postmarked Lincoln's New Salem. In 1837, Lincoln moved to Springfield, Illinois to practice law. He lived in this house with his family until he went to Washington as president in 1861. This magnificent 117-foot-tall monument stands over Lincoln's tomb in Springfield, where his body was returned after his assassination. Outside the tomb, there is a larger-than-life sculpture of Lincoln's head, and it is customary for visitors to rub his bronze nose, seeking through the sense of touch to make personal contact with one of America's greatest historical figures. Each one of us paid our tribute to Lincoln in this way. From Illinois, we crossed over the mighty Mississippi River, the largest river in the United States, immortalized in legend and song as Old Man River and the Father of Waters. Across the river, we entered the state of Iowa, known far and wide as the land where the tall corn grows, evidence of which we found on both sides of the highway as we continued to follow Interstate Route 80 west. Nebraska was our next new state, where we were most impressed by the sight of grazing herds of black Aberdeen Angus cattle. When we reached South Dakota, we were fascinated by the world's only corn palace, the entire exterior of which is covered with varied-colored ears of corn. Then in western South Dakota, we stopped to spend some time in the famous Badlands National Monument. This is a large, barren area of strange peaks, spires, canyons, and ridges whose weirdly beautiful landscapes provide outstanding examples of natural erosion. We didn't even set up our tents that night, but slept out in the open, in our sleeping bags under the wide western sky. As we stretched in the fresh morning air, we felt that now at last we had reached God's country away from civilization. We enjoyed climbing some of the smaller peaks. Look at the top of the peak in the background where early birds Dave and Dan had already reached the summit. That afternoon we encountered the buffalo. We had heard that the largest remaining herd of bison in America was roaming wild in Custer State Park, part of the beautiful Black Hills of South Dakota. By great good fortune, we were able to locate them in an open grazing area and drove right up in the middle of the herd. It was the closest we had ever been to wild animals like this, and we were thrilled to be able to stand quietly right in the midst of hundreds of these magnificent beasts, whose numbers had once been in the millions on America's western plains. This shaggy old bull crossed the road right behind us, looking just like the picture on a buffalo nickel. One of the most interesting and scenic drives in all America is the so-called Needles Highway through the rocks and pinnacles of South Dakota's Black Hills. These towering granite spires are almost overwhelming. But looking up, we could see the vertical opening through one of them that gives it the name of Needles Eye. In places, the road tunnels right through the rocky hillside. Also located in the Black Hills are the giant sculptured faces, the largest in the world, of 4 United States presidents, memorialized at the Mount Rushmore National Monument: Washington, Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Lincoln. This is truly an awesome sight. Each head is over 60 feet tall, carved out of the mountainside with drills and dynamite by master sculptor Gutzon Borglum, working on it many years before he died in 1941. Further north in South Dakota, we visited the site of what at one time was America's largest gold mine, Homestake, which had been a very active place during the mid-'80s gold rush. Nearby, in the historic valley town of Deadwood, we saw the place where one of the West's most legendary figures and hard-living gunfighters, Wild Bill Hickok, had been shot in the back while playing poker in 1876. Preserved in the local cemetery is Hickok's grave, and next to it is that of one of America's most colorful frontier women, the famous Calamity Jane. Getting up to the southern border of North Dakota meant driving 150 miles out of our way, but we could leave no state unvisited, so even though it had no major attractions on our must-see list, we did get out and take pictures of its spacious grasslands. On our way back, we added to our travel trophies a stop at the geographical center of the USA. The big attraction in northeastern Wyoming was the Devil's Tower National Monument. It is an amazing, massive protuberance of grooved volcanic rock, nearly 1,000 feet tall, having eroded over millions of years. Its origin is the source of countless Indian legends. Midway across the cowboy state of Wyoming, we were able to attend a bona fide Western rodeo in the town of Sheridan, with dozens of skilled horseback riders and a large supply of livestock. We didn't have very good seats for photographing the action, but we did witness a variety of events, including calf roping in the foreground here, and in the background, a bucking bronco with a rider trying to stay in the saddle for 10 seconds or more. which was no easy feat. They also had a bulldogging contest, with the cowboy diving off his horse, grabbing a bull by the horns and trying to wrestle it to the ground. The final event we saw was a man trying to ride a large, humped Brahma bull. That evening we camped at the Prune Creek Campground in the Bighorn National Forest, and the next morning we decided to take advantage of the cool, clear mountain stream and give ourselves shampoos to freshen up for our next adventures. In Cody, Wyoming, we admired the statue of the famous Western hunter, guide, and showman William F. Buffalo Bill Cody. Then it was on to our first 1960 national park, the Grand Tetons, where the reflections of the still snow-covered mountain peaks in the blue lake below offered a beautiful vista for peaceful contemplation and soulful inspiration. One of our major objectives for this summer was the incomparable wonderland of Yellowstone National Park, the first and largest national park in the United States, having been established by Congress in 1872. Its fantastic variety of natural marvels is not matched in any other place of similar size in the world. Immediately upon entering the park, we enjoyed the sight of a family of bears along the roadside. Everyone is warned not to get out of their car in the presence of bears, but for some people, the chance to photograph two cute little cubs climbing a tree proved to be irresistible. The most famous Yellowstone attraction of all is Old Faithful, the spectacular giant hot water geyser which erupts so regularly at an average interval of 63 minutes that every visitor can count on knowing when to have their camera ready. Heated water from an underground spring goes shooting skyward in successive spurts, reaching an average height of nearly 150 feet and lasting for approximately 4 minutes. What a sight! There are hundreds of other geysers throughout the park, and each offers a brilliant new hue of mineral colorization, or, at varying intervals, a splashy surprise. The turbulent Yellowstone River flows through the park at the bottom of a steep V-shaped canyon, the sides of which reflect the sunlight in varying colors. There are two magnificent waterfalls within the valley, viewable from special sightseeing spots along the rim like Artist Point and Inspiration Point. The thunderous upper falls are just over 100 feet tall, but the beautifully framed lower falls drop a distance of over 300 feet, nearly twice the height of Niagara, a never-to-be-forgotten sight. From Yellowstone, we had to drive more than 400 miles through the mountainous state of Montana to reach our next camping ground, which was in beautiful Glacier National Park in the northwestern part of the state bordering Canada. We found an ideal campsite among the tall trees at the base of one of the park's many towering mountains. We had slept well that night in our easily set-up small tents, and our portable pantry had made getting breakfast an easy task. We took most of the morning off, relaxing and doing assigned chores like dismantling, rolling up, and packing the tents, or reading more about Glacier Park in the National Geographic Wilderness Parks book we had brought with us. We weren't planning to do any actual mountain climbing here, but we were interested in viewing some of the more than 50 live glaciers in the park and feasting our eyes on the beautiful blue glacier lakes. It was fun to have a midsummer snowball contest at one point along the incredibly spectacular 70-mile-long Going to the Sun highway, winding its way through the park along the precipitous sides of the mountains. Near the midpoint of the drive, we had the experience for the first time of crossing the Continental Divide at Logan Pass at an elevation of over 6,000 feet. Water falling on the east side of this ridge would flow eventually to the Atlantic Ocean, while water falling on the west side would flow to the Pacific. The children literally straddled the continent by standing with one foot on each side of the line. Before stopping at a new campsite at the western end of Glacier Park, we took the opportunity to go on a group horseback ride along a scenic woodland trail, again within the view of tall mountain peaks. We bid farewell to this mountain paradise by going for a swim in the deep blue but somewhat frigid waters of Lake McDonald. We didn't spend much time passing westward through the narrow upper part of the sparsely populated state of Idaho, but we always enjoyed brief walks with new horizons before us. When we finally arrived in the westernmost state of Washington, we could not help but be impressed by the Grand Coulee Dam, at that time the largest concrete structure in the world, 4/5 of a mile long and 500 feet high. It was the greatest such structure yet built by the hands of man. We visited the dam en route to our 4th national park of the summer, the flower-bedecked Mount Rainier National Park, whose meadows overflow with an exquisite variety of wild alpine flora. As seen mirrored here in Reflection Lake, the glacier-covered summit of Mount Rainier, 14,410 feet high, the 4th highest mountain in the USA, is hidden in clouds, but it remains a magnificent landmark of the great Northwest. It was at our campsite here in Mount Rainier that we had a frightening experience when a black bear, much larger than the exhibition stuffed one shown here, broke open our neighbor's icebox so close to our tents that all 5 of us spent the rest of the night locked inside our station wagon. The great port city of Seattle was our next stop, where we viewed Puget Sound from the top of the Smiths Tower, which 2 years later would be supplanted as the city's chief landmark by the 600-foot Space Needle built for the Seattle World's Fair in 1962. We crossed Puget Sound by ferry and drove around the Olympic Peninsula, stopping en route to visit a state-operated salmon fish hatchery, where we were fascinated at the sight of thousands of tiny, just-hatched baby salmon already valiantly seeking to leap upstream against the flow, as they would need to do as adults when returning to spawn. We tried to befriend a young deer in our next wilderness park, the Olympic National Park, located in the center of the peninsula at the northwest corner of the nation. We could see from this viewpoint on Hurricane Ridge why its rows and rows of snow-capped peaks made some people call it the Switzerland of America. Approaching the Pacific coast, we turned southward and took a ferry across the Columbia River into the shoreline state of Oregon, near the point where Lewis and Clark had ended their historic exploratory exhibition in 1805. And finally, after driving 4,927 miles from home, the Barstow family had likewise reached the Pacific Ocean and could go west no further. Setting up camp at a seaside state park, we used all of our senses to appreciate the awesome beauty of this rugged coastline: sight, sound, smell, touch, and even taste. Driving along the Oregon coast on the spectacular U.S. Highway number 101, we stopped to look down at the seals on Sea Lion Rock and listen to their loud roar, which Mary described as sounding like halfway between an unhappy cow and an angry lion. Of course, we couldn't leave the Pacific Ocean without testing these waters all the way on the other side of the continent. So in we went through the shallow waves. It didn't take long for us to discover, however, that this seawater was much colder than we were used to, so back out we came, even faster than we had gone in. Then it came time for us to turn around and head homeward again, so each of us regretfully waved goodbye to the broad Pacific. David, Mary, Rob, Meg, and Danny, and we headed back east. Before leaving Oregon, we spent a day at another famous national park, the exquisitely blue Crater Lake, This incredible body of water fills the crater of an extinct volcano, with the steep circular walls rising to rims which are up to 2,000 feet high. Rowboats can be rented to see the lake from the surface, and the depth of the water in some places is as much as 2,000 feet. The lake has no inlet and no outlet, so its water comes solely from rain and snow. Evaporation keeps the water level fairly constant. Swimming here was a fantastic experience. The water was cold, but it was unbelievably pure and refreshing. We had never seen water with such a deep blue color. The setting was so beautiful, we used it for our family's annual Christmas photo that year. During lunchtime at our campsite, we once again had a 4-footed visitor. This large brown bear apparently just wanted to scavenge for food in the trash barrels, so we didn't really feel endangered this time. The next new state on our homeward trek was Utah, with its capital in Salt Lake City, which was founded in 1847 by pioneering Mormons under the indomitable leadership of Brigham Young. Seagulls saved their crops from crickets the first year. The world-famous Mormon Tabernacle provides perfect acoustics for their choir, but the temple here can only be entered by members of the Mormon Church of the Latter-day Saints. Going for a swim in the Great Salt Lake is a unique experience. You float practically on top of the surface. The water here is saltier than that of any other lake in the world except for the Dead Sea. It's so dense that a human body just can't sink. Eastern Utah is dinosaur country. Prehistoric giants like the Brontosaurus, Tyrannosaurus rex, and Triceratops used to roam here, and many fossils have been found in this area. Life-size models help visitors to imagine what these amazing creatures, which actually did once exist but have been extinct now for millions of years, might have looked like. A dinosaur national monument has been established on the Utah-Colorado border, with a unique visitor center, one side of which is the actual wall of a quarry where fossil remains have been uncovered. From our nearby campsite, we made an on-foot excursion to visit this monument and its special exhibits. Here we could see giant bones still embodied in the rock and learn how paleontologists carefully remove the fossils and then assemble them in the form of complete skeletons. Our next destination was the state of Colorado and Rocky Mountain National Park, where on Sunday morning we attended an inspiring outdoor worship service conducted by the Interdenominational National Park Ministry. This is where we crossed back over the Continental Divide at Milner Pass, this time traversing from west to east, looking behind toward the Pacific and ahead toward the Atlantic. The Trail Ridge Road through Rocky Mountain National Park, much of it over 2 miles high, is one of the world's highest highways, and the highest point on this road is over 1,200 feet up. We felt this would be a good place to do a bit of Rocky Mountain climbing ourselves, so we all got out of the car and managed to clamber up to a rocky vantage point where we could look down at the highway below and up to the even higher mountains above. Just outside the park, in the ski resort town of Estes Park, we found a marvelous miniature golf course. We had established a tradition of finding one outstanding miniature golf course every summer on our family camping trips, and this turned out to be one of the best, with all kinds of fancy loop-the-loops and other contraptions for each one of us to have the fun of putting a golf ball through. We got a good view of the famous Pikes Peak, Colorado's highest mountain at over 14,000 feet, after driving south through Boulder and Denver, and we stopped for a short visit at the United States Air Force Academy near Colorado Springs. Then it was on to the world's highest suspension bridge at the famous Royal Gorge of the Arkansas River in Cannon City, Colorado. This 1,200-foot-long engineering wonder spans the highest and most precipitous spot of the Royal Gorge at a height of over 1,000 feet above the river. Completed in 1929, this fantastic suspension bridge carries both auto and pedestrian traffic. At the bottom of the gorge, the railroad tracks of the Denver and Rio Grande Railway worm their way through the narrowest part of the canyon alongside the winding Arkansas River. This incredible train route has been operating since the late 1800s. At one point on the side of the canyon, an open carriage takes passengers down a steep inclined track to the bottom of the gorge. From which the view to the bridge at the top is almost incredible. Now we were ready to head fast for home, admiring the white-faced Hereford cattle that we passed on the plains of the Jayhawk state of Kansas, and stopping in Dodge City, Kansas, to have our pictures taken in front of the reconstructed Long Branch Saloon of Western fame. Missouri was our last new state this summer, and in the river town of Hannibal, we examined Tom Sawyer's whitewashed fence and were reminded that Mark Twain had written that story back in our own home state of Connecticut, in the Mark Twain House in Hartford, where Twain had lived when writing Tom Sawyer in the 1870s. So that made a good ending for our 1960 trip. Well, after that trip to the Great Northwest, we still had 7 more states to go to meet our goal of visiting all 48 states. And we spent much of the next year getting ready for our 5th summer of family camping in 1961. If you may think back, you may remember that this was when the youthful John Fitzgerald Kennedy had just become president of our United States. And his vigor, I think, helped to inspire our family to gear up to meet this final goal. Actually, you may have noticed that we went through New York, parts of New York State on the 3 previous summers, but we never had really gone to New York City itself, the Big Apple. And so we did go for one extra family excursion in the spring of 1961 down to New York City, and with a foreign exchange student who was living with us at that time, Sigrid Newman, we visited the Statue of Liberty and a number of other of the New York City sites. We took a ferry out to what is now called Liberty Island, on which stands one of the most colossal sculptures in the history of the world, and the single most symbolic structure in the entire United States. We had arranged to meet on the dock my father, the Reverend Robbins W. Barstow, Sr., who before his retirement had had an office at the National Council of Churches in New York City. He had offered to show us key points of interest, including this monumental statue of Liberty Enlightening the World, a gift from the people of France to the people of the United States, erected here in 1886 to commemorate France's help in the American War of Independence and our two countries' abiding friendship. Rising 300 feet above the base of its gigantic stone pedestal, the statue was created by French sculptor Auguste Bartholdi out of copper plates and steel girders. Long flights of interior stairs lead to observation windows in the statue's crown, from which there is a tremendous view of the harbor and the New York City skyline. Times Square, located at 42nd Street and Broadway, is an awesome sight for small-town visitors. This is the way the Great White Way looked like in 1961, with its huge lighted advertising signs and bright theater marquees. Walking just a few blocks on to Fifth Avenue, we came to the over-towering landmark of the Empire State Building, rising to a total height of almost 1,500 feet. When we visited it in 1961, this was the tallest building in the world, nearly 500 feet higher than Paris's renowned Eiffel Tower. From the observation deck on the 102nd floor, people in cars down below looked like ants and beetles. Over in the distance, along the East River, we could see the United Nations buildings, and this was our next destination, descending the steps by Isaiah's Wall of Peace across from the Avenue of Flags.
The United Nations was established in 1945 at the close of World War II to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. This is the UN's permanent headquarters, including the 39-story Secretariat building, opened here in New York in 1952. It was inspiring to walk past the flags of virtually every nation in the world, including that of Austria, the homeland of our exchange student Siggy. We were impressed at the global significance of this one place where representatives of all countries can meet together to discuss, debate, and take action to help bring about peace and maintain justice throughout the world, not always successfully, but providing humankind's best hope for all in the future.
Well, after that, we really concentrated on mapping out a route through the Southwest that would enable us to visit all the remaining 7 states that we hadn't yet been to, and also the national parks and other attractions that we determined we wanted to see in this last summer. Actually, it turned out that summer we went 9,600 miles. And I was able to get my vacation extended by 5 days, so we had a total of 35 days, and that meant we actually only averaged 267 miles a day, and there were several places where we were able to stay more than one night. But there were still more than 300 hours of family living in the car, driving on the road. And the fact that our family of 5 was able to survive 300 hours during that period of time in that car and still be a happy and intact family, we felt really good about. It wasn't all sweetness and light. We had some problems from time to time, but we finally did accomplish our goal, and now I'll show you the route that we took that summer in 1961, the last route. In 1961, we started again at our home in Wethersfield, Connecticut, and made a quick trip down here through Ohio and Indiana and down to Kentucky. That was another new state. Mammoth Cave there. Through Tennessee we'd been to, but Arkansas was a new state. And then across Oklahoma, another new state. And the top part of Texas here, that's another new state. New Mexico, Santa Fe, and up into Colorado again, at Mesa Verde National Park. And then down into Arizona, one more new state, and the Grand Canyon National Park, and then finally came the big moment. We were ready to cross over into our 48th state, Nevada, and that's what we did at the Hoover Dam. And so we'd made our goal, but now we wanted to go on sightseeing. So we went down into California, across the Mojave Desert, and stopped at Barstow, California. There's a town called Barstow. And then we went up and up through to the Sequoia National Park and on up to Yosemite National Park, which we really loved, and then across to San Francisco and down past the Monterey Peninsula, the west coast of California, all the way to Los Angeles, and that's where we went to Disneyland again. We spent a whole other day in Disneyland and the Marine Land of the Pacific, and then on down to San Diego and the San Diego Zoo, and we did go across the border to Tijuana, Mexico. So that we'd been to another country also, and then back across the southern part of the states that we'd been to before, and visiting the Carlsbad Caverns. And in Texas, we went down to San Jacinto and Houston, and over Louisiana, and up through Vicksburg, Mississippi, and on back up the same route all the way home, and boy, we had made it. Well, there you have our 1961 summer route, and looking at the map of the whole United States, you can see the tremendous amount of traveling that we did do in those 5 summers. So we were able to go all over our great, wonderful country, and it turned out that that last trip of ours made some news, because on the Saturday, the 8th of July, 1961, the Hartford Courant had a front page article, "Area Family Nears Goal to Camp in Every State." A family of 5 from Wethersfield set off Friday on a trip which they hope will wind up a 5-summer effort to camp in each of the 48 states in the continental United States. And that's just what we did. Actually, before we really started on the trip itself, we engaged in some warming up exercises to get us all ready for that great Southwest and its many scenic attractions.
Again headed out in our carefully packed Rambler station wagon with the one-wheel trailer behind it, and we wasted no time traveling over the Pennsylvania Turnpike, observing road signs which identified our destination this year as South and West. As usual, we enjoyed wearing homemade matching outfits, which helped give us a sense of family unity. For this longest of our summer trips, David and Daniel had both gotten butch haircuts, which enabled them to put their heads together effectively for solving brotherly problems. Our first new state in 1961 was Kentucky, where we visited the Mammoth Cave National Park, an amazing natural attraction since it was first explored by whites 200 years ago. The giant cave contains more than 150 miles of underground passageways. We joined a tour group descending the steep entrance stairs, and among other wonders experienced a boat ride on the high-vaulted Echo River 360 feet below the surface. Also in Kentucky, we visited the log cabin site where Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809. Then, traveling down through the western part of Tennessee, we stopped in Nashville to see the Hermitage, the beautiful southern mansion which was the home of General Andrew Jackson, President of the United States in the 1830s. As Mary wrote in her journal, you can really learn a lot about a person by visiting their home. At Memphis, Tennessee, we came again to the mighty Mississippi, and this time we crossed this greatest of American rivers into the state of Arkansas. We weren't able to stay very long at the Hot Springs National Park there, but we did stop to feel the warmth of the hot waters rising from 47 natural springs in the park, which have been providing healing therapy for many people for many years. When we reached Fort Smith at the western end of Arkansas, we had the welcome benefit of being able to spend the night at the home of some longtime family friends who had recently moved from Connecticut to Arkansas, Neil and June Cox, and their 4 children, Anna, Kathy, Chip, and Jeff. Having been on the road camping out now for almost a week, we were really ready for some of the less primitive comforts of a modern suburban home. "Would you like to have a home-cooked meal?" they asked us. "Put your sleeping bags on a wooden floor, brush your teeth in a private restroom, wash your clothes, take a shower, and get all cleaned up and refreshed for the next part of your trip?" We said we sure would. So this time, instead of setting up our tents, the 3 children just opened up the back of the station wagon, where I had constructed a wooden platform with individual compartments for each of their travel suitcases, and they took out the bags, along with each one's individual toilet kit, to take to the house. Everyone was really tired out from all our long-distance traveling to this point, now midway across the country, but the children did manage to drag themselves into the Cox's comfortable residence for a good long sleep. The next morning, we were all refreshed and everybody was ready to start out again for the continuation of our sightseeing odyssey to the great Southwest. With warm thanks to all of the Cox family, we climbed into our 20th century covered wagon and headed west into our next state, Oklahoma, where the winds come sweeping down the plains and the fields have barbed wire fences wide and far. We stopped to say hello to a couple of buffalo, which were behind a chain fence at the side of the road. Whoops, don't get too close. And then we entered Texas for the first time, stopping to visit the stockyards in Amarillo in the northwestern panhandle part of the state. Amarillo is where they had the world's largest livestock auctions, with cattle like these, raised on the range, brought in and kept in various pens until they were auctioned off and shipped to the slaughterhouse to be killed for beef. Seeing these live animals made us wonder about eating the 50-cent hamburger suppers which we often had while on the road. Driving across the line into New Mexico, we immediately realized that this truly was a land of enchantment, with magnificent scenery all around us. For the last part of our way, we had been traveling over the final leg of what had been known in pioneer days as the Santa Fe Trail, one of the chief routes followed by wagon train settlers on their way west from Independence, Missouri. Santa Fe is the capital of New Mexico, and the city maintains its historic connection with the Spanish Southwest through its parks, monuments, museums, and public buildings. It was fun to set our feet on the actual spot identified by this marker as the end of the Santa Fe Trail. In the museum courtyard, the children were interested in a long-ago wagon which had wooden wheels. Some of the buildings, like this ancient house in Old Santa Fe, date back hundreds of years, including the time-honored San Miguel Mission, the oldest church in the United States, having been built around 1540 when the Spanish came up from Mexico. We loved the picturesque Spanish colonial architecture around the city plaza, with pink adobe walls accentuated by the ends of large wooden beams protruding overhead. The historic Palace of the Governors here is a long one-story porch building now housing a museum. Native Americans sold beautiful handcrafted wares along the inner wall. In Santa Fe, we enjoyed the luxury of again staying overnight with friends, this time sharing the lovely hillside home of two fellow educators, Charles and Kay Wood. North of Santa Fe, we had the remarkable experience of entering a whole new world when we visited the Taos Pueblo Indian village. As Mary wrote in her journal, it seemed as if we had come upon a new civilization entirely different from anything we had ever seen before. This still lived-in Pueblo settlement was made up of adobe houses piled one on top of each other like toy building blocks, artfully arranged to a height of 5 stories. For the first time, we had the opportunity to talk face-to-face with Native Americans in their own habitat and to share with them their pride in their continuing contrasting culture perpetuated in this beautiful setting with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains for a backdrop. Moving up into southern Colorado, at a place called Wolf Creek Pass in the San Juan National Forest, we found an isolated wilderness campsite where a sparkling mountain stream was our refreshing morning wash basin. After buying some Western clothes and cowboy hats in Durango, we entered Mesa Verde National Park and drove up the long, winding road to the top of this towering green table. The incredible view from Park Point Lookout brought to life for us the words of Catherine Lee Bates' inspiring hymn to America. "O beautiful, for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountain majesties above the fruited plain." The first thing we did whenever we arrived at a national park was to look for a vacant campsite. Most of them had a wooden table and a fireplace, but it took a bit of skill to maneuver the car and trailer into the best spot for them to be parked. Then we would unload the equipment from the rooftop and set up our camp. Everyone had an assigned task to get things ready for sleeping and eating. We used these neat little self-supporting pop tents, which took some muscle power to push the top down and fasten the latch, but then the bottom would just pop out and it would stand by itself. Though we couldn't quite figure out how David had gotten inside this one. We had to have a quick and easy system for packing and unpacking because almost every night we were in a new place. Our neighbors in adjoining campsites were invariably friendly and pleasant, and we always hung out this small wooden sign to let them know that we were the 5 Barstows from Wethersfield, Connecticut. Our homemade portable pantry proved to be a great help when it came to making sandwiches and preparing simple campsite meals. After lunch, we took a fascinating tour led by a park ranger to see some of the most amazing archaeological ruins any place on Earth. 1,000 years ago, this area had been inhabited by Pueblo Indians who were mostly farmers. Their evolving culture reached its peak in the 1300s when, for some unknown reason, the Pueblos moved into great caves on the sides of the canyon walls, where they constructed incredible cliff dwellings with a unique kind of carved stone architecture. But after dwelling here for less than 100 years, these Pueblos all moved out, possibly because of a long drought, and they mysteriously vanished from history. The enormous cliff dwellings still stand, now being preserved almost as they were when abandoned 700 years ago. Cliff Palace is the largest of the ruins, with both round and square towers several stories high and more than 200 rooms believed to have housed up to 500 people. Heading further west and south to the border between Utah and Arizona, we had our first view of the mystical vistas of Monument Valley. These fantastic buttes, mesas, and pinnacles, rising up to 1,000 feet above the desert floor, are the work of nature over millions of years, carved by wind and water, and now a never-to-be-forgotten part of the Navajo Tribal Park on the nation's largest Indian reservation. Monument Valley's two most photogenic landmarks are the giant twin buttes known as the Mittens, because of the rock spires sticking out like thumbs on each of their sides. They have provided the dramatic setting for many Western movies. Arizona was our 47th state, but the dry heat as we drove across its desert wastelands was almost unbearable. We had purchased a canvas water bag, which we kept tied to the front bumper of the car, so the wind blowing through it would keep the water cool. Every once in a while we would stop and take turns drinking from the bag. Daniel, age 10, David, age 13, Mary, age 16, Meg, age 40, and Robbins, age 41. Swallowing large gulps of the cool, refreshing drink helped clear up the atmosphere and return the color to our faces and clothes. It kept us going for our next big travel adventure. Arizona is the home state for one of the greatest of all the world's natural wonders, the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River. We had arrived at the Desert View campground too late for sightseeing the first night, but the next morning, after a tasty breakfast of bacon and eggs cooked on our Coleman stove at our campsite, we were ready to follow the Watchtower Trail to the south rim and look out for the very first time on this unbelievably huge chasm carved out over millions of years by the force of the now tiny river far below. The gorge stretches out 12 miles across, 1 mile deep, and more than 200 miles long. We had all seen photos of this overwhelmingly spectacular canyon, but they could not prepare us for the awesome reality of actually experiencing it on the scene in person. On this wall, I couldn't resist the impulse to jump off down onto a lower level where I could get a better view of the vastness and variety of the canyon's multicolored rocky walls at every place and time of day. Before leaving the Grand Canyon, we had the opportunity to visit the Pueblo settlement of a local tribe of Hopi Indians and to witness the performance of some remarkable ceremonial dances. The highly athletic dancers wore brilliantly colored costumes as they circled and chanted in traditional rites invoking rain and good harvests for their crops. In one beautifully symbolic dance, two braves wore eagle feathers on their arms in tribute to these great local birds of flight. The favorite feat for park visitors was the amazing hoop dance performed by a young Hopi with incredible speed and agility, jumping continuously through a single hoop time and time again. And now we were approaching the long-awaited climax of our epic summer journey, entering our last new state, Nevada. We found that the borderline between Arizona and Nevada was located right in the middle of the curved roadway on top of the giant Hoover Dam blocking the Colorado River. We parked our car on the Arizona side and walked up to the boundary line where there was a metal plaque marking the spot. And at 4:48 p.m. on Thursday, July 20th, 1961, the Barstow family all together stepped over the line into their 48th state. How many states have we now been into? We got a friendly tourist to film our raised arms count. 48. As Mary wrote in her journal, now when we meet anyone from any state except Alaska and Hawaii, we can say, oh yes, we've been there. These dramatic winged figures overlooking the dam point skyward to our nation's flag, 48 of whose stars we now could identify with. Hoover Dam itself is a monumental engineering achievement, built in 1935 and over 700 feet high, providing flood control, irrigation, and great amounts of electrical energy. It also has created the world's largest man-made reservoir, Lake Mead, whose recreation area has become a popular vacation spot. This is where we camped that night, enjoying a refreshing swim in the lake, though the minute you rose from the water, your body was completely dried off by blasts of hot air. That evening, we celebrated by going into nearby Las Vegas to see what gambling was like. We loved the bright lights, but we each learned our lesson by losing a quarter to a one-armed bandit slot machine. Moving on into Southern California, we had the fun of visiting the town with the same name as ours, Barstow, at what they call the intersection of opportunity, right in the middle of the Mojave Desert. We stopped at the city hall and learned that the town had been a frontier mining settlement and railroad junction, given the name of Barstow in 1886 after the president of the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad Company, William Barstow Strong. The folks at City Hall called the editor of the local newspaper, who did an interview with us that was published on July 26th in the Barstow Desert Dispatch. The caption under their photo read, "The Barstow family arrived last week to visit their namesake town. They are from Wethersfield, Connecticut, and have spent 5 summers camping across the United States." Sequoia National Park is located in the Sierra Nevada mountains near the center of California. This is where the tall trees are, the tallest on Earth. Some of these giant sequoias are hundreds of feet high and thousands of years old. As we contemplated the incredible size of these enormous trunks, we suddenly found ourselves face to face with 2 other families from our hometown of Wethersfield, Connecticut. The Willards and the Irwins, who by amazing coincidence were camping here all the way across the country at the same time we were. The growth rings on this cross-section of an ancient stump indicate that at the time Jesus was born, shown by this marker, the tree was already several hundred years old. And here we also found the famous General Sherman tree, the largest in the world, 272 feet tall, and perhaps the oldest living thing on Earth, with an estimated age of more than 3,500 years. Then we came to Yosemite, half a day's drive north of Sequoia Park. We arrived at dusk at the southern entrance, where there was a fantastic gateway cut right through the middle of another giant sequoia tree. This famous Wawona tunnel tree was hollowed out in 1881 for stagecoaches to drive through, but it still survives. It was an awesome thrill to drive our own station wagon right between the living sides of this 26-foot-long tree tunnel. A California mule deer greeted us here in the Mariposa Grove, as if wanting to make us welcome in this towering tree-shaded part of Yosemite's natural wonderland. The next morning, we had a chance to refresh ourselves in one of the most unusual swimming holes we had ever seen. Over thousands of years, a rushing stream had flown through a rocky riverbed and worn down the stones to make smooth, rounded pools and even a perfectly shaped natural water slide, which we all enjoyed coasting down with the current, each in our own way. When we were about to leave the southern part of the park here, we almost thought we had lost Daniel, because when he went into the opening in the side of this monstrous tree trunk, it was David who came out. Going further north in Yosemite, we had the awe-inspiring experience of driving through this long rock tunnel and coming out at the end to view this absolutely magnificent vista of Yosemite Valley, one of the most spectacular panoramic scenic sights in all the world. What was originally a V-shaped river valley had been turned by successive glaciers over millions of years into a U-shaped trough with sheer granite walls, peaks, and domes on all sides. El Capitan was on our left, and in the distance we could see Half Dome with its rounded top 7 miles down the valley. On the right were the rugged cathedral rocks, from which in the springtime Bridal Veil Falls leap precipitously down to the meadow below. The colossal El Capitan is the largest exposed granite monolith in the world, rising straight up more than 3,000 feet from its base and more than twice the size of Gibraltar. From our lucky campsite, right in the middle of the valley, we looked up in awe at the great cliffs towering thousands of feet above us, with picturesque waterfalls cascading down their steep sides. The next day, we drove up the winding road to Glacier Point on Sentinel Dome, from which we looked down thousands of feet to the valley floor and across to the supremely beautiful upper and lower Yosemite Falls, with a combined drop of over 2,000 feet. Someplace down in those wooded glens were our tent and trailer, along with hundreds of other campers. From here, we could get a closer view of the awesome half dome, like a gigantic marble split right through the middle, straight down for nearly a mile to the floor below. This view inspired us to want sometime to actually get to the top. There's a trail around the back side of it, so you can hike there. And later, years later, David and Daniel returned to Yosemite and with their dad did hike to the summit of Half Dome for a tremendous experience. Back at our campground, we encountered another bear, but again it was not one that was apparently dangerous, just scrounging for scraps in the trash barrels. Of course, it's strictly forbidden to feed any animals, and the rangers keep close tabs on their wildlife. But having a bear around did add to the interest and excitement of staying there. When we reached the great coastal city of San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge was shrouded in fog, but we drove across it to a campground on the north side of the bay, and the next day we crossed back to tour this fascinating city. After smelling the fresh fish at Fisherman's Wharf, we all went for a ride on one of the famous cable cars, which, since 1873, have carried passengers up the steep streets of this fabulous city built on hills. The cable cars are pulled along by gripping a continuously moving underground cable going at the rate of 12 miles per hour. San Francisco's Chinatown was said to be the largest Chinese colony outside of China, and we stopped to eat a delicious Oriental meal here, using chopsticks for the first time. When our cable car reached the top of Nob Hill, we were rewarded with a beautiful view of the world's longest single-span suspension bridge, the Golden Gate. On our way south, along the coast from San Francisco, we photographed the famous seaside cypress tree on the picturesque 17-mile drive around the Monterey Peninsula. Further along, we found a place where there was a public park with a beach. So this is where we went for our 1961 swim in the Pacific Ocean. It was still cold, but we did enjoy the gentle surf here. Near Los Angeles, we spent a day of wonder at Marineland of the Pacific. The main attractions here were not fish, but marine mammals like this California sea lion, which seemed to enjoy diving off this high platform with other sea lions applauding his performance. There also was a trained bottlenose dolphin, which they had taught to play baseball. A man batted the ball into the water. The dolphin grabbed the ball in his mouth and tossed it back to shore, and the batter was out. On the upper deck, they had a giant saltwater tank where, for the first time, we were able to see live whales right up close. At that time, back in 1961, Marineland had 2 black pilot whales, the first in history to have been captured alive in the ocean and brought ashore for display. It was amazing to see the smaller one, a 14-foot female named Bubbles, leap into the air over a hanging horizontal bar, imitating a breaching behavior often observed in the wild, from which Bubbles had been taken in 1957. Keeping the whales company in this tank were some high-leaping Pacific white-sided dolphins, also captured live and trained to perform with rewards of food. The biggest attraction at Marineland, however, was an 18-foot male weighing 3,000 pounds, whom they had named Bimbo. Pilot whales are toothed whales with a single blowhole on the top of their heads. They are relatively small compared to the 60-foot sperm whale and giant baleen whales like the 100-foot blue whale, but you can see how large Bimbo was compared to his human trainer as he propels himself up out of the water to return this dumbbell. Wow! Then our 3 children had the exciting experience of being chosen to go out and stand on that platform while Bimbo took their picture. What he did was to jump out of the water and grab a large cork tied to a rope that was attached to a camera, and by pulling it down, he snapped the picture. That was a never-to-be-forgotten moment. And here is the actual photo taken by a whale showing Bimbo at the time that he pulled the rope down, with Daniel, David, and Mary standing right next to him. The biggest fun of all this summer, though, was the day we spent in Disneyland, Walt Disney's original Magic Kingdom in Anaheim, California, just south of Los Angeles. We spent 15.5 hours there, from 8:30 in the morning right up to midnight, at what is known as the happiest place on earth. We had been there 5 years earlier in 1956 when Daniel had won that contest, but this time it was even more fantabulous, to use Mary's apt description. We enjoyed all the old rides like the Santa Fe and Disneyland Railroad circling the park, past the various sights including the waterfall at Cascade Mountain, the realistic wild animals in the painted desert, and the pirate ship hidden in a cove. In Frontierland, we paddled big Indian canoes and rode the raft across to Tom Sawyer's Island with its rock and roll water barrel bridge. By this time, Disney had added a new landmark, the towering snow-capped Matterhorn Mountain, with a hole in the middle of it for the Skyway cable cars to pass through. Another new attraction was the monorail, a pioneering new system of mass transportation linking the older realms of Adventureland and Fantasyland with the futuristic wonders of Tomorrowland. These electrically powered trains running on elevated concrete beamways, highways in the sky, really were fun to ride in, with their broad windows giving an overhead view of all the activities down below, including the watery lagoon where a fleet of specially designed passenger submarines now took visitors on exciting underwater voyages. Of course, we all wanted to experience this unique water world adventure. Once having descended into the hull and having the hatch closed, each passenger sits in front of an individual porthole, so you can look out at gorgeous underwater gardens, coral reefs, and exotic, brightly colored fish. In actuality, the submarine is never totally submerged, but as it moves rapidly along, you really feel like you are in the ocean depths. This was a ride we went on more than once. Over at the Matterhorn, an exact scale replica of the famous Swiss mountain peak, we saw a couple of real-life climbers rappelling down the side with ropes and giant leaps. This led us to the ride which, for Robbins and the three children, was the most fun of all, the Matterhorn bobsled run. We could scarcely contain our excitement as we raced over to the entrance gate to wait our turn in line to board the twin-seated bobsleds, which, after hauling us up inside the mountain to the 140-foot summit on metal rails, took us speeding down and around the slopes and in and out through tunnels till the sleds finally splashed down into a glacier lake at the bottom. The third time we went on this ride, I took along my movie camera to try to capture how thrilling it was to ride these rails around and down till we ended up plunging into the water at the end. You had to be taller than the bottom of this sign to drive one of the gas-powered automobiles on the Autopia freeway, and this time Danny made it and had great sport taking the wheel all by himself for a happy drive down Disney's Road to Utopia. That day in Disneyland, which actually lasted until midnight, was indeed a day of days for all of us. The port city of San Diego, at the southern end of California, is famous for its zoo, one of the finest in the world. Holding a playful little lion cub in her arms was an unexpected treat for Mary. And in the special children's zoo part of the park, where a goat, tapir, and baby camel were among the friendly animals, Daniel even got to ride on the back of a giant Galapagos tortoise, which had incredibly strong legs. Many of the animals in this zoo were displayed in open-air settings without bars. Look out there, Dan. We especially admired these beautiful Siberian tigers. After San Diego, we made a one-day side trip into the country of Mexico. In the town of Tijuana, just over the border, there's a bull ring, outside of which is a monumental statue of a group of large fighting bulls being rounded up. The so-called brave bulls, which we saw here, had been bred for bullfighting, and like the steers we had seen in the Texas stockyards on their way to the slaughterhouse, these bulls were about to die. Here they were killed by a matador with a sword in a Spanish spectacle hundreds of years old, which was very different for us. From Mexico, we started heading home, stopping to learn all about all kinds of cactus plants in Arizona's Sonora Desert Museum. Then in New Mexico, we had the fun of playing barefoot on the shiny dunes of White Sands National Monument, the world's largest gypsum desert. These dunes are made up of tiny white gypsum particles, constantly blown by the wind, and it was quite an experience to run, somersault, and slide down the smooth, hot, slippery slopes like walking in piles of pure white sugar. The first atomic bomb test explosion was set off about 50 miles north of this area. We also stopped at the Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico for our final national park. Much larger and deeper than Mammoth Cave, which we had visited in Kentucky at the start of this summer's trip. We ate lunch in a giant limestone cavern 750 feet underground. Then, traveling through the southern part of Texas, we saw the historic Alamo and finally stopped at the San Jacinto Memorial Monument, the world's tallest stone structure commemorating the 1836 battle in which the Texas Republic won its independence from Mexico. Here, the Barstow family made a final hats-off salute, not just to the Lone Star of Texas, but to the stars of all the 48 United States we now had visited. As Mary wrote in her journal, it was really wonderful to have taken these trips so that we could see so much of our country and meet so many of its people.
Well, that's the story. We hope you've enjoyed it of these 5 summers of camping trips with our Barstow family all across our wonderful country. The day after we got back, the Hartford Courant had a follow-up story, this time with a photograph, on Saturday, August 12th, 1961. Mission accomplished. 5 years ago, the Barstow family of Stillwell Drive, Wethersfield, planned to visit the then 48 United States on summer camping trips. They returned to Wethersfield Friday. Mission accomplished. The last state visited was Nevada on July 20th. So we felt really great about this, and these trips, the places that we went and the things we did gave us such a tremendous appreciation of the great breadth and beauty and wonderful diversity of this marvelous country of ours. And I think the memories of it have stayed with all the members of the family throughout our lives, and we're so grateful to have had the opportunity to do this, and we appreciate your letting us share it with you now. And thank you again for watching. Take care and give thanks.
We hope you've enjoyed this Barstow travel adventure film. We'll be releasing more of Robin Barstow's home movies on this YouTube channel during 2021. Click here to subscribe and receive the latest updates. Meanwhile, enjoy these other films by a master of home movie storytelling in the pre-digital era.